Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
Picture the most powerful being ever to walk the face of this earth. Not a myth, not a symbol carved in stone. A real, breathing, thinking, feeling person. Born to a mother and father in a village so ancient no name for it survives. A child who grew up among people who had never heard of stars beyond the sun, who believed the world ended at the edge of the nearest forest. A child who, from the very first years of his life, could feel things no human should be able to feel. The weight of other people's thoughts pressing against the inside of his skull. The cold silk of something vast and hungry brushing against the back of his mind in the darkness before dawn. A child who would live to watch empires rise and crumble. Who would watch the wheel of history turn so many times that kings and conquerors blurred together into one long, unbroken parade of human ambition. Who would walk through the Black Death and the Crusades, through the fall of Rome and the birth of nations, through the first photograph, the first plane, the first nuclear flash? Who would still be walking when humanity finally clawed its way to the stars? And who would then, after 10,000 years of patience, after a lifetime spent watching and guiding and suffering, step forward into the open and say, now is the time. Now we build something that lasts. Right now, at this exact moment in the Warhammer 40,000 universe, that same person is sitting in a chair. He has been sitting in that chair for over 10,000 years. His physical body has been decaying for a millennium. His bones are visible through skin that barely holds its shape. He cannot speak. He cannot move. He cannot open his eyes. And yet, somewhere deep in the architecture of the galaxy, deep in the churning psychic currents of a dimension that exists alongside our own and feeds on human emotion like fire feeds on oxygen, his mind burns with the force of a small sun. Every single day, 1,000 people are brought into a chamber beneath his feet and drained of their life's energy so that his light does not go out. And if it does go out, the empire of humanity, spread across 1,000,000 worlds and home to hundreds of billions of people, will go blind in the dark. Ships will lose their way in a dimension where time folds back on itself, and ancient monsters made of nightmare feast on lost souls. And then the darkness, which has been pressing against the wall since before recorded history, will finally get in. This is the story of how one man got from that ancient village in Anatolia to that chair. It is not a simple story. It is not a comfortable story. In places it is beautiful, and in other places it is genuinely horrifying. And there are moments where it is both of those things at the same time, and you cannot quite separate one from the other. It is the story of someone who loved humanity so completely that he was willing to do things that looked, from the outside, like terrible cruelty, because the alternative was the extinction of the species. It is the story of someone who was, for a very long time, the wisest and most powerful being on this planet, and who still managed to get things catastrophically, galaxy-shatteringly wrong. It is the story of a father and his sons, of a dream and its undoing, and of what it means to sacrifice everything and still lose. Take a breath, get comfortable, pour yourself something warm. We are going to start at the very beginning, and this beginning is a long, long way back. There are older lore videos out there, shorter ones that cover the headlines and move on. This is not that kind of video. This one is going to take its time, because the Emperor's story deserves time. It deserves the space to breathe, to develop, to be felt, as well as understood. So settle in. We have a lot of ground to cover, and every single part of it matters. Section 2. The Shamans and the Birth of the New Man. Before we talk about the Emperor, we need to talk about the Shamans, because that is where this story actually begins. Not in the 30th millennium with gleaming armies and starships the size of cities. Not even in the ancient world of Greece and Rome. We need to go much, much further back. We need to go to the Stone Age, when humanity was still very young, somewhere around 10,000 years before the birth of Christ. In what archaeologists would eventually classify as the Neolithic period, the world was a quieter place in some ways and a far more dangerous place in others. There were no cities yet, no writing, no metal tools. The population of the entire planet was smaller than a modern mid-sized country. Human beings lived in small groups, moving with the seasons, following game, planting the first tentative crops in river valleys where the soil was rich and the flooding predictable. But the world of Warhammer 40,000 does not work quite like our own. Running alongside the physical universe, not above it, not below it, but existing in a kind of parallel dimension that occupies the same space, is a place called the Warp, the Imperium, the Sea of Souls. Call it what you like, but understand this. It is a place that is shaped by emotion. Every feeling a living creature ever has, every flash of joy, every pulse of fear, every flicker of hatred or grief or desire, bleeds into the Warp like heat bleeding into cold air. The Warp is made of those feelings. It is built from them. And as humanity grew and spread and became more complex, as our emotions deepened and diversified and gained new edges, the Warp shifted in response. Now, in those ancient days, the Warp was still relatively calm. The great nightmares that would eventually take shape within it, the four Chaos Gods, those entities of almost incomprehensible power that feed on human feeling the way a fire feeds on wood, had not yet fully awakened. 3 of them were stirring. Horn, the blood god born of rage and violence, had begun to rouse as warfare spread across the ancient world. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, born of hope and ambition and deceit, had flickered into dim consciousness as human societies grew complex enough for politics and scheming. Nurgle, the grandfather of plague born of despair and the fear of death, had yawned and stretched as disease moved through early cities. But they were still forming, still incomplete. Not yet the roaring, galaxy-spanning nightmare entities they would one day become. And in that window of time, humanity had something precious, the shamans. The shamans were the first human psychers. They were men and women born with a natural sensitivity to the Warp, individuals who could reach across the boundary between the physical world and that impossible dimension of feeling and pull things back with them. Visions, warnings, glimpses of what lay ahead and what lay beyond. They were the wise people of their communities, the healers, the ones who sat at the edge of the firelight and talked to things that lived in the dark and came back with answers. They had something extraordinary. They could reincarnate. When a shaman died, their soul did not simply dissolve into the Warp the way ordinary human souls did. It held together. It pooled its energy in that psychic dimension, gathered strength, and eventually found its way back into a new body. Generation after generation, the same souls returning, yet carrying forward accumulated wisdom, each cycle building on the last. They were, in a very real sense, the custodians of humanity's future. As long as the shamans existed and guided their people, humanity had a chance of navigating the dangers that the universe, and the Warp especially, held in store. But the world was changing. As humanity grew in numbers and sophistication, as those proto-chaos entities grew stronger on the fuel of human emotion, the Warp grew more turbulent, and something began to happen that terrified the shamans. When they died, their souls were no longer making it to the other side intact. Something in the Warp was waiting for them. Hungry things, ancient things, were proto-demonic entities that had been fed by human fear and suffering since the earliest days of the species. These things were catching the shaman's souls before they could pool and reincarnate, devouring them, not just ending their lives, but ending the accumulated wisdom, the countless generations of experience and knowledge, the long, unbroken thread of understanding that the shamans had been building for centuries. One by one, these precious souls were being consumed, and with each one lost, humanity's greatest guardians grew fewer. They could see where this was heading. A day would come when the last shaman died, when that last soul was devoured before it could return. and then there would be nothing between ordinary, unguided humanity and the growing darkness of the warp. The human species, without its wise ones, without its psychic guides, without the accumulated knowledge of thousands of reincarnations worth of understanding, would be vulnerable, exposed, eventually, inevitably, consumed. So the shamans gathered, from every corner of the ancient world, from every community that had ever held a wise man or woman, every healer and seer and spirit talker, they came together in what the law describes as a grand conclave, the greatest gathering of psychic minds humanity had ever seen, all sitting together in one place, and all of them facing the same terrible conclusion. They could not win, not individually, not as they were, but perhaps, if they pulled everything, perhaps they could do something that would be worth all their deaths. The decision they made was not taken lightly. You have to understand the weight of it. These were people who had spent multiple lifetimes serving their communities, people who understood what death meant, not in the abstract philosophical way most of us do, but with a bone-deep certainty, because they had died before and remembered it. They knew exactly what they were choosing, and they chose it anyway. They entered a suicide pact, thousands of shamans all across the world, all at more or less the same moment, poisoned themselves. The exact mechanism of the ritual has been lost to time, or perhaps the Emperor himself is the only one who truly knows what happened in those final hours. But what the law tells us is that as those thousands of souls released from their bodies simultaneously, they did something different from before. Instead of scattering into the warp individually, was where they would have been easy prey for whatever was waiting for them, they moved together. The sheer force of so many souls releasing at once created something powerful enough to overwhelm the hungry things that had been devouring them. A wave of psychic energy so vast and concentrated that it punched through the danger, pulled in the warp, gathered itself, and then, 1 year later, was born as a child with the combined experience of thousands of lifetimes encoded somewhere in the architecture of his mind, with psychic potential that dwarfed anything humanity had ever produced before, because it was the product of all those lifetimes of careful, deliberate accumulation, with an immortal soul, because the shamans had perfected the art of reincarnation, and they had poured that ability into him, that would never dissolve, never be devoured, never be lost. They called what they were creating the new man, the next step in human evolution, the being who would be, for humanity, what they themselves had been for their own small communities, but at a scale previously unimaginable, the guide, the guardian, the shepherd for an entire species. He was born, as best as the law can establish, somewhere around 8000 BCE, in a small proto-Hittite Neolithic village on the banks of a river in central Anatolia, the region of the world that is today called Turkey. He was born to ordinary parents who had no idea what they had brought into the world. A dark-haired child, tall even from early childhood, with eyes that caught light in a way that people found slightly unnerving without quite being able to explain why. As he grew, the memories began to come back. Well, not all at once. That would have been overwhelming. Gradually, in fragments, the way a person remembers a dream upon waking, catching it in pieces before it fades. The accumulated lives of the shamans were still there, buried in the architecture of who he was, surfacing over years and decades until eventually he held within himself a resource of knowledge and experience that no single human being in history had ever possessed. And when he was still young, still an adolescent in fact, he had an experience that seems, looking back, to have set the direction of his entire existence. His father was murdered by his uncle. While preparing his father's body for burial according to the rituals of his people, the boy received a vision, not a dream, not a symbolic impression, but something with the clarity of direct experience, a clairvoyant sight of the moment his uncle's hands had closed around his father's throat. He saw the act. He felt the intent behind it. He understood, with terrible clarity, what human beings were capable of when there was no law strong enough to restrain them. The lore is sparse on what happened next. We know that the uncle died. We know that the boy stopped his uncle's heart using only the force of his own psychic will. His first recorded act of direct psychic power used as a weapon. And we know that in the aftermath of that moment, sitting with the body of his father in a village that would never make it into any history book, he made a decision that would still be reverberating 10,000 years later. Humanity needed to be protected, not just from the things that lurked in the dark places between the stars, but from itself, from the pettiness and violence and selfishness that lived inside every human soul, right alongside the capacity for greatness. The only way to protect the species was to guide it, and the only way to guide it, really guide it, across the vast sweep of time it would take to reach a point where humanity could stand on its own, was to endure. He had the shaman's ability to reincarnate. He had their immortality. He had time that ordinary humans could not even conceptualize. And so he began, not with armies, not with proclamations, not with any of the grand gestures that would come so much later. He began simply by walking, by living, by watching and learning, and occasionally carefully, reaching out a hand to nudge the course of events in directions that seemed to lead somewhere better than the alternative. He was, for a very long time, the most important person in the world, and nobody knew he existed. Section 3. 10,000 years, walking among men. Think about what it means to live for 10,000 years. Human memory is unreliable over decades, over centuries. What was personal experience becomes legend, and legend becomes mythology, and mythology becomes religion, and religion becomes architecture, and architecture crumbles into grass. The world you were born into does not simply become unrecognizable. It disappears so completely that future scholars argue about whether it existed at all. Now multiply that by 100. As the man who would one day be called the emperor of mankind watched the entire written history of human civilization unfold from beginning to what most people in the 41st millennium call the present. He was there for all of it, not as a spectator with a good seat, as a participant, a living human being, moving through time, eating food and breathing air, and getting cold in winter and hot in summer, walking roads that would become cities, that would become ruins, that would become farmland, that would become cities again. He watched the first writing appear on clay tablets in Mesopotamia. He felt the weight of bronze tools and iron swords and steel blades, each material representing a new chapter in humanity's ability to reshape the world. He walked through the flowering of every great civilization this planet has ever produced. What we know about this period is frustratingly fragmentary. The lore offers glimpses, not a full picture. And honestly, that's probably appropriate, because the full picture would require a library to contain. What we know is this: he did not spend those 10,000 years idle. He moved among people under different names in different eras. He had been a shaman himself, many shamans technically, and he understood the power of knowledge and the fragility of what humans called wisdom. He guided where he could, protected where he could. Sometimes that meant standing at someone's side and offering counsel. Sometimes it meant engineering situations from a comfortable distance, nudging events toward outcomes that seemed to point, however obliquely, toward a future worth having. He watched the chaos gods grow, that long, slow process of entities forming in the warp as human civilization generated more and more emotional energy to feed them. He was watching it happen in real time, from the inside. He could feel it, the world getting louder in the psychic sense, the pressure in the warp increasing year by year as humanity spread and multiplied and fell in love and went to war and grieved and hoped and feared on an ever-expanding scale. Horn, fully awake now, drunk on 10,000 years of human warfare. Tzench, spinning his webs through the politics of every empire that had ever grown large enough to have politics worth manipulating. Nurgle, patient and enormous, stirring in the dark rivers of human suffering. each one a danger so fundamental that most human beings could not even begin to conceive of it, and all of them, in their different ways, running their fingers along the edges of the physical world, testing for weaknesses, looking for ways to reach through. And there was something else happening too, in the background, in the long middle centuries of the Age of Terror, the era in which the Emperor was quietly living his very long life. There were other people like him, not exactly like him, nothing was exactly like him, but individuals who shared one crucial characteristic. They could not die, not permanently. The Perpetuals, they were sometimes called in later ages, humans touched by some quality of life that refused to be extinguished. They died, sometimes violently, but they came back, and they had been alive long enough, most of them, to understand that the universe was a significantly more complicated and dangerous place than ordinary humans realized. As the Emperor moved among these people, some of them he knew, some of them he trusted, in the careful, conditional way that someone who has watched enough betrayal learns to trust, with eyes open and contingency plans ready. There is one Perpetual whose story intersects with the Emperor's in a particularly important way, though that story comes a little later in this account. For now, what matters is this. The Emperor was not entirely alone in those long millennia, even if he was, in the most fundamental sense, completely singular. He also had a relationship with Mars, not the planet as it eventually became. The rust-red domain of the Mechanicum is covered in forge complexes and cathedral factories and the endless churning industry of the tech priests, but the planet as it existed when humanity first began to seriously contemplate the stars. During the long period, the 40,000 law calls the Dark Age of Technology, roughly from around 15,000 CE to around 25,000 CE, humanity had achieved something genuinely extraordinary. They had mastered faster-than-light travel. They had spread to the stars. They had developed artificial intelligence, genecraft, force fields, weapons that could level continents, and any number of other technologies that would have seemed like pure fantasy to the people of the present day. Mars had become an industrial heart of this civilization, a world of forges and laboratories run by scientists who were barely distinguishable from priests. During this period, something happened that is recorded in the lore with the frustrating vagueness that characterizes many of the most important events in this story. The Emperor, still walking, still watching, still the most powerful human being alive though no one knew it, traveled to a world called Molech. It was a night world, meaning it was colonized by humans who had built their civilization around the enormous walking war machines called knights. It was also home, deep beneath its surface, to a gateway, a portal into the warp, into the dimension of psychic energy and ancient entities. And the Emperor went through that gateway. What happened inside, we do not know in full. What we know is that he emerged with knowledge and capabilities he had not possessed before. The ability to create, to synthesize, used to engineer life itself at a level of sophistication that went beyond anything his accumulated 10,000 years of human experience had granted him. He made a bargain, the lore implies, with what or whom is left ominously unspecified, and the terms of that bargain are one of the most persistent mysteries in the whole of Warhammer 40,000 canon. What is not mysterious is what he used that knowledge for, eventually, but we are getting ahead of ourselves, because before any of that was possible, something happened to human civilization that made everything the Emperor had been quietly building seem suddenly and desperately urgent. It fell apart. The Dark Age of Technology did not end gracefully. It ended in catastrophe. Section 4, The Age of Strife and the World in Ruins. There is an irony at the heart of humanity's story that the Emperor, with his long view of history, must have felt more keenly than anyone. The same capabilities that made the Dark Age of Technology the greatest period of human achievement in history, the psychic abilities that allowed astropaths to communicate across the stars, the navigators who could find their way through the warp, the psyker soldiers and sanctioned witches who served in human armies, were also the seeds of its destruction. Because the warp was changing, that long, slow process of the chaos gods growing stronger, of the dimension that ran alongside physical reality becoming more turbulent and more dangerous, was not happening in isolation. And when the greatest catastrophe in the history of any species finally detonated, when an entire civilization essentially tore itself apart in a moment of such staggering, galaxy-scale self-indulgence that the psychic shockwave was felt across thousands of light years, the warp did not simply change, it erupted. The Eldari, an alien civilization so old that humanity had barely learned to plant crops when they were already building starships, an intelligence so refined, so sophisticated, so capable that individual Eldari artists could spend entire millennia perfecting a single piece of music, and so decadent, at the height of their power, that they had inadvertently done something unprecedented, feeding their lusts and excesses and pleasures without limit or consequence for so long, was generating so much concentrated psychic energy of such specific flavors in the warp. They had birthed a god, not a metaphorical god, an actual one, an entity of chaos that had not previously existed, summoned into being by the sheer weight of a civilization's worth of emotion. Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, the youngest, and in some ways most terrifying of the four great powers of chaos, because unlike the others who had grown slowly over millennia from the background noise of countless lives, Slaanesh had erupted into existence all at once, in a moment, consuming the souls of billions of Eldari in the instant of its birth and tearing a wound in the warp the size of a civilization. This was roughly the 25th millennium, and the shockwave from that birth hit the warp like a stone hitting a still pond, yet except the stone was the size of a small moon, and the pond was the psychic infrastructure underpinning all of human interstellar civilization. The warp storms began immediately, not storms in the meteorological sense, storms in the psychic sense, vast churning disturbances in the Imperium that made faster-than-light travel effectively impossible. Ships that had been crossing the galaxy in weeks now faced years of journey time, if they survived the journey at all. The warp had become a place where time moved unpredictably, where chaos entities prowled the currents looking for unprotected souls, where a ship could enter and emerge a century before it departed, or 1,000 years after. Human civilization, which had been built on the assumption of reliable, faster-than-light communication and transport, found that assumption suddenly violently invalid. The interstellar civilization shattered. Colonies that had been in regular contact with Earth and with each other went silent, cut off behind impassable walls of warp turbulence. The artificial intelligences that humanity had created, the Men of Iron, as the lore calls them, had already revolted at the end of the Dark Age of technology, in a war that had left both sides crippled, and now the survivors of that catastrophe were alone, isolated on their individual worlds, with the technology they had inherited but not fully understood beginning to fail around them. On Earth, Terra, as it would come to be called, the situation was particularly dire. The planet that had been the origin and capital of humanity's greatest civilization became, over the course of a few centuries, a place of genuine nightmare. Warlords rose from the ruins of the old government, each controlling a fragment of the planet's resources and population, each locked in perpetual competition with the others. The weapons of the Dark Age of technology, atomics, biological agents, chemical warfare, engineered plagues, and things considerably worse than any of those, were turned against human beings by other human beings. Because when the choice is between killing your neighbor and dying yourself, most people choose violence. The damage was catastrophic and lasting. Great swathes of Terra became uninhabitable. The oceans acidified. The air in some regions became permanently toxic. Radiation burned through entire continents. Technologies that nobody alive truly understood failed and could not be repaired. Population centers became fortresses, and fortresses became the cause of new power structures that had nothing in common with the civilization that had preceded them except the buildings they occupied and the weapons they wielded. This period lasted, in its full horror, for roughly 2,500 years. That is not a typo. 2,500 years of essentially uninterrupted warfare on the surface of the planet that would one day become the capital of a galactic empire. Warlords rose and fell. Techno-barbarian nations built themselves on the ruins of the old world and tore each other apart in turn. Mutants appeared, the radiation and the biological weapons having done their work on the human genome, and were treated with the special cruelty that humans reserve for those who look different enough to be frightening. And psychers appeared in greater numbers than ever before, because the warp was more turbulent than it had ever been, and psychers were humanity's nervous system for that dimension, and they were persecuted and exploited, and in many cases drove themselves and those around them to destruction when they could not control what they could feel pressing against them. Into this world, the Emperor watched, still walking, still enduring. He had been alive through the golden age that preceded this, and he had known that something like this was possible, had perhaps known, with his long view and his psychic sensitivity, that it was eventually inevitable. The shamans had feared exactly this scenario, a humanity without guidance, without wisdom, without the thread of understanding that connected what humanity was to what it could be. And here it was. But he was also waiting, because the Emperor, whatever else you might say about him, had always been a being of tremendous patience. He had not spent 10,000 years quietly watching and nudging without developing a very precise sense of when the moment was right to act. And the warp storms, paradoxically, had created something that he needed, a window, a period of relative isolation for Terra, which meant that whatever he built on Terra could grow and develop without immediate interference from the wider chaos of a fractured galaxy. He had been preparing for a very long time, in the hidden laboratories and workshops that he had maintained and developed over centuries, places that existed below the surface of the world, tucked away in mountain ranges and desert regions where the warlords' wars did not reach. He had been building towards something that would require the planet to be unified before it could be deployed. Something that would require peace and industry and the full focused, productive capacity of all of humanity's surviving civilization on the planet that had once birthed that civilization. He needed Terra. And so, finally, after 10,000 years of watching and waiting, he stepped into the light and announced himself. Section 5, Thunder Warriors and the Unification of Terra. When the Emperor finally revealed himself, he did not do so quietly. The world he was revealing himself to was a place where power spoke loudest in the language of violence. Techno-barbarian warlords had spent centuries in an unbroken cycle of warfare, and the culture that had emerged from those centuries was one that respected strength above almost everything else. Diplomatic overtures alone, even from someone with the Emperor's psychic gifts and personal presence, were not going to be sufficient. Some of the powers on Terra were too deeply entrenched, too invested in their dominance, too fundamentally committed to the idea that the world as it was should continue to be as it was, for any amount of clever persuasion to move them. He needed an army. What he built was something that the galaxy had never seen before. The Thunder Warriors. Formerly, they were known as the Legiones Contagious. They were created from adult men, warriors who had already proven themselves in combat, who had already demonstrated loyalty to the Emperor and his emerging cause. Through a process of biological and chemical augmentation that was extraordinary even by the standards of the technology-rich dark age of technology, gene crafting, alchemical modification, muscle grafting and skeletal reinforcement, the process was brutal and not all of them survived it. And those who did emerge from the other side were something new, not human exactly, not in the conventional sense, transhuman, physically larger than ordinary men by a significant margin, faster, stronger, more durable, possessed of combat capabilities that placed them in a category entirely apart from anything the warlords of Terra had ever faced. They wore armor that was itself a kind of statement, heavy, articulated suits of powered ceramite that shrugged off bolter rounds and sword blows alike, painted and decorated according to their different legions. There were 20 of these legions, echoing a number that would recur again later in the Emperor's grand design. Each had its own character, its own culture, its own particular flavor of controlled aggression. Some were patient and methodical, specialists in siege warfare. Others were shock troops built for the kind of sudden, overwhelming violence that broke an enemy's will before their numbers could be brought to bear. Together, they were the Emperor's blade, the instrument with which he intended to cut through 2,500 years of fractured barbarism and forge something unified from the shards. Alongside the Thunder Warriors, the Emperor had another, more selective force, his Custodian Guard, where the Thunder Warriors were created in significant numbers, enough to field 20 legions. Each Custodian was crafted individually, with a level of care and precision that the Thunder Warriors' bulk production could not match. They were larger even than the Thunder Warriors, more refined, possessed of a kind of controlled perfection that the Thunder Warriors, with their psychological instabilities and short lifespans, could never achieve. The Custodians were not simply bodyguards, though that was part of their function. They were an elite within an elite, a demonstration of what the Emperor could create when he applied everything he knew to a single individual rather than to a production line. He also had ordinary human forces, armies of soldiers who were not augmented but were well-trained, well-equipped, and fighting for a cause that offered them something the warlords never had, the genuine possibility of a better future. And he had alliances, where alliances were possible. The Terrawat clan, for example, whose advanced weapons and industrial resources made them valuable partners, and who became, early on, one of the most significant suppliers of military material to the Emperor's forces. The Unification Wars, as history would come to call them, were not a single campaign. They were decades upon decades of grinding, brutal, continent-spanning conflict fought against an extraordinarily diverse range of opponents. Because Terra, after 2.5 millennia of techno-barbarian dominance, was not a monolith. It was a fractured world of dozens of different power structures, each with its own military capabilities, its own culture, or its own relationship to the technologies of the old world. The Morland-Sen Confederacy, in the Nordic regions, was one of the earliest major targets. They were a powerful civilization, but one that had allowed itself to be infiltrated and manipulated by something that the Emperor regarded as an existential threat to humanity, the influence of chaos. Their priest-king conducted human sacrifice and practiced forbidden genetic manipulation that bore the fingerprints of demonic corruption. The Thunder Warriors crushed them. The priest-king was executed by the Emperor personally, not as a display of cruelty, but because the Emperor had spent 10,000 years watching what happened when things like chaos corruption were allowed to fester, and he had no patience for leaving such things alive. But the Pan-Pacific Empire was another matter entirely. Under its tyrant Nathan Doom, it was one of the most powerful polities on Terra, vast in territory, sophisticated in its military, and led by a man who was genuinely cruel in ways that went beyond mere ambition. The war against the Pan-Pacific Empire was among the longest and most costly of the Unification Wars, but it fell eventually, as they all fell. Then there was Albia, and this is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because not every campaign in the Unification Wars ended with Thunder Warriors kicking in the door. The Albians were remarkable. Built in the tradition of Old Earth's British Isles, they had developed their own transhuman warriors. Not gene-crafted space marine precursors, but something indigenous to their own military tradition. Your massive armoured Ironside soldiers, proto-dreadnoughts that bellowed steam and swung weapons capable of challenging the Thunder Warriors on something approaching equal terms. Battle after battle, the Albians fought the Emperor's forces to exhaustion, falling back in good order when they had to, never breaking, never routing, simply refusing to be defeated in any way that felt permanent. The Emperor recognized something. This was not the resistance of a people clinging to power because they feared losing it. This was the resistance of a people with genuine pride, genuine strength, genuine self-determination. Crushing them would be wasteful, not merely in the military sense, but in the deeper sense that the thing that made the Albians worth fighting was the same thing that would make them worth having. He called a ceasefire. And then he did something that no warlord of the age would have thought to do. He went to the Albion clan lords, alone, without armor, without weapons, without the Thunder Warriors at his back. He came dressed in white and crimson, unarmed, and he spoke to them. He told them about his vision, about what he was building and why, about the galaxy that waited beyond the atmosphere of this battered, scarred, radiation-sick planet. The billions of human beings scattered across thousands of worlds, isolated and afraid and alone behind walls of psychic storm.
Okay, I want to pause here for a second and just be honest with you. I've read a lot of 40k lore, a lot, and no matter how many times I come back to the Emperor's story, this part, the Webway project, the secrecy, the way his silence created exactly the conditions his enemy needed, it genuinely frustrates me every single time. Not because it's bad writing, but because it's too human. You have this being who has lived for 10,000 years, who's smarter than anyone, who can see further than anyone, and he still cannot bring himself to simply trust his sons with the full truth. And that one flaw, that one thing that looks so small against the scale of everything else he has, costs him everything. That is the Emperor to me, not the gold and the power. That. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
About what it would mean for humanity to be reunited, to have something to stand together against the darkness, rather than fighting each other on a rock in space while that darkness waited patiently outside. He offered them not submission but inclusion, not defeat but partnership. What he told them that if they became part of what he was building, their people's strength and skill and stubbornness would be remembered, not as a footnote to conquest, but as a pillar of what was constructed. The Albion clan lords accepted, and they became, in fact, exactly what he had promised they would be, not the defeated remnants of a conquered people, but genuine contributors to what followed. Some of the most dedicated and effective troops in the wars that came afterward were Albion, people who had chosen to join rather than being simply overrun. Other territories were less amenable. The Caucasus ethnarchy had enslaved psychers and used forbidden weapons of the dark age of technology. The first assault against them had cost 20,000 Thunder Warriors and 1 million other casualties, which should give you a sense of how ferocious some of this fighting was. The Emperor sent the Proto-Space Marine Legions, a more refined military force he had begun developing alongside the Thunder Warriors, to destroy the ethnarchy's underground power generators before launching the final assault. When the force fields fell, the ethnarchy fell with them, and so it went. Nation by nation, warlord by warlord, through decades of campaigning that covered every continent and many of the seas, the Frank kingdoms, the Merica territories, the Achaemenid Empire, which was wise enough to recognize the emperor's legitimacy early and was treated with corresponding generosity, the High Brazil region, whose last independent ruler fought hard enough that his descendants were allowed to remain as governors, though Malcador, the emperor's increasingly important advisor and closest friend, made certain that those descendants were kept away from real political power. Some territories were shown patience that bordered on extraordinary. The kingdom of Boeotia, for example, spent over 150 years in a curious in-between state, technically acknowledging the emperor's dominance, while in practice maintaining its independence through diplomatic maneuvering. The emperor allowed it. He was building something for the long term, and he understood that forcing a civilization to submit before it was ready created the kind of resentment that festered for generations. What he gave the Boeotian ruling family their dignity for as long as dignity was sustainable, and when it was finally time to integrate them fully, the groundwork had been laid for it to happen with a minimum of destruction. Not all of them got that patience. The Antarctic civilization, which had built itself around a religious framework that the emperor regarded as deeply, fundamentally dangerous, not because religion was inherently wrong, but because this particular religion was the kind that opened doors into the warp that could not easily be closed again, was obliterated, not conquered and absorbed, obliterated. There are depths of pragmatism in the emperor that read, from the outside, as coldness, but they make a certain terrible sense when you understand what he understood about what lived on the other side of those doors. As the final battle of the Unification Wars, the Battle of Mount Ararat, in what had once been a kingdom called Urartu, is recorded in the official Imperial histories as a glorious last stand in which the surviving Thunder Warriors gave their lives in one final heroic charge. Their greatest leader, a Thunder Warrior named Arik Taranis, known as the Lightning Bearer, raised the banner of lightning at the moment of final victory and then died of his wounds, his service complete, his sacrifice honored. This version of events is, unfortunately, a deliberate fiction. The Thunder Warriors had not died to a man at Mount Ararat. They had been liquidated. The truth is this: the Thunder Warriors, created in desperate haste from adult men using techniques that were effective but far from perfect, had always been flawed. Their genetic augmentation was unstable in ways that the process used for later Space Marines would not be. They aged faster than they should have. Many of them suffered from metabolic collapse, bodies that had been pushed beyond their natural limits, beginning to fail in ways that no amount of medical intervention could reverse. More dangerously, they suffered from mental instability, the psychological toll of what they had become, the constant hormonal flood, the biological drives wound to a pitch that human minds were never designed to sustain, was producing warriors who were, over time, becoming genuinely dangerous, prone to psychosis, prone to violence that had no target and no purpose, prone to the kind of collapse that, in a heavily armed transhuman soldier, could result in catastrophic casualties. There was another reason. Before the end of the Unification Wars, a group of Thunder Warriors had made a discovery. The Emperor had created them with limited lifespans. The instability in their augmentation was not accidental, but a consequence of the techniques used, and those techniques had been chosen with the knowledge that these warriors would be replaced. The Space Marines, whose development was already well underway, were built from a different template entirely, more refined, more stable, with functional immortality and a lifespan limited only by violence rather than biology. When the Thunder Warriors realized what had been done to them, that they had been created as a temporary instrument, powerful but expendable, with short lives built into the design, some of them rebelled. The records are fragmented and disputed, but there was a final confrontation, a kind of coup attempt, in which a group of Thunder Warriors, led by one of their command-equivalent leaders, turned against the Emperor. The Custodians, alongside elements of the nascent Space Marine legions, put the revolt down. The surviving Thunder Warriors, those who had not participated in the revolt, but who shared its biological and psychological vulnerabilities, were hunted down and eliminated. A handful escaped, living anonymous lives in the lower depths of Terra's hive cities, always afraid of being found, their great deeds officially credited to a heroic death that never happened. Some survived long enough to encounter Space Marines decades later and discovered that even then, worn down and degrading, they were still formidable enough to kill several Astartes before being brought down. What the Emperor buried the truth and erected the legend in its place. The Thunder Warriors had been necessary. They had served. They had won the Unification Wars and made everything that followed possible. And then they had been discarded, not with ceremony, not with honor, but quietly, as tools are discarded when they have served their purpose and their continued existence has become a liability. It is one of the darkest parts of the Emperor's story, and it is important not to look away from it. This was not an accident. This was not a failure of foresight. This was a deliberate decision, made by someone who genuinely believed he was acting in the best interests of humanity, to create living beings, use them until they were no longer useful, and then eliminate them, rather than deal with the consequences of their nature. Must the Imperial histories call it the Thunder Warriors' heroic sacrifice? The truth is considerably less comfortable. With Terra unified, the Emperor turned his gaze upward. Luna fell next. The Earth's moon, brought under Imperial control. Then the rest of the Sol system, planet by planet and moon by moon. The Emperor forged a pact with the Martian Mechanicum. Not a conquest, because Mars was too powerful and too distant to take by force, and because the tech priest possessed knowledge of ancient technology that he needed, but a formal alliance. Mars would be the forge of the Imperium, its industrial heart, its keeper of technological secrets. In exchange, the Mechanicum gained the Emperor's protection, recognition, and access to resources they could not obtain alone. And now, for the first time, whilst the warp storms that had isolated the Sol system and so much of the rest of the galaxy were beginning to calm, Slaanesh had been born and fed, and was no longer generating the same psychic turbulence that had accompanied its gestation. The seas of the Imperium were becoming, in relative terms, navigable again. The stars were waiting, but before the Emperor could reach for them, he needed something else. Something he had been working on for a very long time, in laboratories even more secret than the ones that had produced the Thunder Warriors. Something that would require the darkness of the warp itself to explain. 20 carefully tended developmental chambers, each containing a consciousness that was simultaneously the most significant military investment in human history and the most profound personal risk the Emperor had ever taken. His sons. Section 6. The Primarchs, the Scattering, and the Great Crusade. The Primarchs are, in a very literal sense, the children of the Emperor. Not metaphorically, not in the sense of spiritual inheritance or philosophical legacy. The Emperor used his own genetic material as the foundation for their creation, his own DNA, modified and amplified and shaped in ways that went far beyond anything ordinary human genetics could produce. Each of the 20 Primarchs was an individual, with his own personality and temperament and particular genius, but each was also, at some fundamental level, a reflection of some aspect of their creator. They were humanity distilled and refined, and pushed to its absolute extreme in 20 different directions simultaneously. But the process of their creation drew on the knowledge the Emperor had brought back from Moloch, the bargain made at that warp gateway that still cast long shadows over everything that followed. It combined the most advanced genecraft of the dark age of technology with something that transcended mere science. The Primarchs were engineered to be physically perfect by any measurable standard. Superhuman in every dimension. Speed, strength, durability, intelligence, reaction time, perceptual acuity, the ability to process and retain information. They did not age in any meaningful sense. They were effectively immune to disease. Their bodies could absorb and recover from damage that would kill an ordinary human being instantly. But they were also more than the sum of their biology. They possessed a presence, a psychic weight, such a quality of personal magnetism that the Emperor had carefully built into them, that made ordinary human beings want to follow them, not through manipulation or coercion, though some of them were certainly capable of both, simply through the force of what they were. When a Primarch walked into a room, people noticed. When a Primarch spoke, people listened. When a Primarch asked for something, people found themselves genuinely wanting to provide it. This quality was as much a part of their design as their enhanced musculature. There were 20 of them, 20 individual personalities, 20 different genetic templates, each one intended to serve as the commander of one of the 20 legions of Space Marines that the Emperor was simultaneously developing. Because the Space Marines themselves, the transhuman warriors who would become humanity's greatest military instrument, were created from gene seed derived from the Primarch's own genetics. Each legion was, in a biological sense, the sons of its Primarch, sharing a genetic lineage that expressed itself in their physical traits, their psychological tendencies, even their preferences in combat, and their innate aptitudes. The Primarchs were created in specially developed gestational chambers beneath the Himalayan mountains, or the Himalaysian precinct as the imperial records call it, each in its own carefully controlled environment, monitored and maintained, and lovingly tended toward the extraordinary lives the Emperor had planned for them. And then the Chaos Gods intervened. Whilst this is one of the most significant and most frustrating moments in the entire story, because what happened remains, in the fine details, genuinely unclear. What we know is that the ruinous powers, the four great entities of chaos, each aware of the Emperor's plans, and each deeply invested in preventing those plans from succeeding, somehow breached the psychic wards that protected the Himalayan laboratories. The wards had been some of the most sophisticated psychic defenses the Emperor could construct, designed specifically to prevent exactly this kind of interference. But the Chaos Gods were ancient and patient, and willing to spend enormous amounts of their accumulated power on this one objective. They could not destroy the Primarchs. The Primarchs were too powerful, too well protected, as their souls too anchored in the Emperor's own genetic material for the entities of the warp to simply unmake them. But they could do something almost as devastating. They scattered them. The gestational chambers were ripped through the warp and scattered to the far corners of the galaxy. 20 chambers, 20 unborn Primarchs, some of them not yet fully formed in the biological sense, dispersed across a cosmos that humanity had not yet mapped, dropped onto worlds that varied enormously in their environments and cultures and levels of civilization. Some worlds were relatively hospitable, some were extremely dangerous. Some had human populations that the Primarch who landed there would eventually come to lead. Some were barely habitable wastelands where survival would be the first and most all-consuming challenge. The Chaos Gods did not do this out of pure spite, though spite was certainly part of the equation. They did it because they were terrified. An Emperor of mankind commanding 20 Primarchs and their legions of genetically enhanced Space Marines, operating with unified purpose and clear direction, that was a threat to the Chaos Gods on an existential level, not because the Emperor intended to enter the warp and fight them directly, but because his long-term goal involved something far more dangerous to them. He wanted to free humanity from its dependence on the warp entirely. He wanted to give humanity a path to the future that did not run through the dimension where the Chaos Gods lived and fed. If he succeeded, they would starve. And so they did everything in their considerable power to stop him at every stage. As the Emperor faced the loss of his sons, with what the records suggest was considerable anguish, because whatever else he was, and however coldly pragmatic he could be, he genuinely loved the Primarchs. But he was also, in his essential nature, someone who assessed problems and found solutions rather than sitting with grief. The genetic material from which the Primarchs had been created was still in his possession. He could not create new Primarchs, not in any reasonable time frame, but he could use those genetic samples to develop Gene Seed, the biological implant system that would transform ordinary adolescent humans into Space Marines. The Primarchs themselves were lost, for now, but their legacy could still be built. The Space Marine legions were founded, 20 legions, each drawing on the gene seed of a different Primarch, each beginning to develop the characteristics that would eventually, when they were reunited with their genetic fathers, be recognized as expressions of those fathers' own natures. The legions trained and grew and prepared, without their Primarchs, for a crusade that their creator still intended to launch, and the warp storms continued to calm. By approximately 798 of the 30th millennium, a date so far in what we would call the future that it almost loses meaning, and yet a date that the people who lived it experienced as simply the present. The storms had calmed enough. The galaxy was not safe. The galaxy has never been entirely safe, and in the Warhammer 40,000 universe it never will be. But it was navigable. Well, ships could pass between stars without a better than even chance of losing years or dying to psychic predators in the Imperium. And the Emperor, with Terra unified and the Sol system secure, and 20 legions of transhuman warriors ready and waiting, launched the Great Crusade. The scale of what followed is genuinely difficult to conceptualize. Think of a galaxy, not a metaphorical galaxy, the actual Milky Way, which contains somewhere between 100 billion and 400 billion stars. Humanity, during the Dark Age of technology, had colonized a significant fraction of the habitable worlds in this galaxy. Those colonies had then been cut off for thousands of years, left to survive on their own, without contact with Earth or with each other, evolving in ways that their original founders could never have predicted. Some had maintained or even advanced their technology. Many had regressed. Some had gone to war among themselves and been devastated. Some had been conquered by alien civilizations that had moved in during the period when humanity was too fractured to defend itself. Some had developed religions or political structures. or biological modifications that placed them, in the Emperor's assessment, outside the pale of what humanity should be. The Great Crusade set out to find all of them. Every human world, every colony, every lost fragment of humanity's scattered civilization. The Emperor intended to bring it all back into a single unified polity under his direct rule, not through the offer alone, though offer was always the first approach, but through force when necessary, because he had seen, over 10,000 years of watching, what happened to isolated human populations when there was no law strong enough to bind them, and he had no intention of leaving the children of humanity to that fate. At its peak, the Great Crusade deployed over 4,300 expeditionary fleets simultaneously, hundreds of thousands of ships, millions of space marines organized into their 20 legions, tens of millions of ordinary imperial soldiers in the armies that would become the Imperial Army, titans, walking weapons platforms the size of buildings, each one the product of decades of manufacture, and capable of devastating an armored division by itself. The vast logistical infrastructure needed to feed and supply and repair all of this, stretched across hundreds of light years of newly conquered space, and at the head of it, for the early years, which was the Emperor himself. He fought in person, he led from the front, he was present at the great battles that would become the founding stories of the Imperium, the kinds of engagements that later generations would build cathedrals to commemorate, that would be painted on the ceilings of basilicas and recounted in sermons on a million worlds across 10,000 years. The Emperor in battle was something that even veterans of the legions found overwhelming to witness. His physical form at full power, clothed in armor that contained psychic focusing technology beyond most people's ability to comprehend, wielding weapons that were as much instruments of psychic force as of physical damage, was genuinely terrifying. His presence on the battlefield shifted the morale calculus in ways that no tactical doctrine could fully account for. But the Great Crusade was not only, or even primarily, about battle. The Emperor's preferred approach was what the records call compliance, the integration of a world into the Imperium through agreement rather than conquest, worlds that accepted imperial governance, that adopted the imperial truth. The Emperor's sweeping rejection of religion and superstition in favor of scientific rationalism, that opened their populations to recruitment for the legions and their resources to the imperial tithe. These worlds were brought in with minimal violence. The fighting was reserved for those who actively refused, those who were too compromised by alien influence or chaos corruption to be negotiated with, and those who simply represented too great a threat to leave operational. And as the Great Crusade pushed deeper into the galaxy, the Primarchs began to be found, one by one, world by world. The Emperor's psychic foresight, combined with intelligence gathered by the expeditionary fleets, began to locate the places where the gestational chambers had fallen. And on each world, what they found was extraordinary, and in some cases deeply troubling. The Primarchs had not simply survived their scattered landings, they had thrived. In every case, on every world, these beings who had been dropped as infants into alien circumstances had risen to dominance. They had overcome the challenges of their environments, learned and mastered everything their worlds had to offer, and in most cases had come to lead the peoples among whom they had fallen. And it was as if their nature made a certain trajectory inevitable, as if you could drop a Primarch into any circumstances whatsoever, and something that looked like destiny would pull the story toward the same endpoint. Horus landed on Chotnia and was found by the Emperor in the earliest years of the Crusade. He was the first Primarch recovered, and there is significance to that. He was everything his creator had intended: magnificent, warm, brilliant, possessed of a tactical genius that operated as naturally as breathing. The bond between the Emperor and Horus was, in the early Crusade, something genuinely moving to observe. The Emperor trusted no one more completely, loved no one more openly. Of all his sons, Horus was the one in whom he saw his own vision of what humanity could be most clearly reflected. Sanguinius came from Baal Secundus, where he had led the winged Burlite people in a desperate survival struggle against the mutants that dominated that dying world. He was in some ways the most purely noble of the Primarchs, a quality that his brothers recognized even if they sometimes found it slightly aggravating in its consistency. He had wings, a physical manifestation of the mutation in his gene line that should have marked him as impure by the standards of some of his brothers, but instead read, in person, simply as appropriate. He was exactly what he looked like. Leman Russ was found on Fenris, having grown up among the world's human populations in conditions of extreme environmental hardship, adopting the cultural framework of those northern warrior clans and wearing it like a second skin. Just the Emperor challenged him personally upon their meeting, a tradition that Russ's people required of any leader, and what followed was something between a contest and a reunion, a test of the bond between creator and creation that ended with Russ's oath of loyalty. Each reunion was its own story. Some were straightforward. Some were complicated by the experiences the Primarch had accumulated in isolation. Angron was found on Nukeria, leading a revolt of slave gladiators, an uprising that the Emperor interrupted in the moment of its potential success, pulling his son away from a battle he was about to win and a death he had apparently already accepted. Angron never forgave him. The relationship between the Emperor and the Primarch of the World Eaters was, from its earliest days, defined by that wound, by the thing the Emperor had taken from Angron when he took him from Nuceria, not the fight itself, but the company of the slave soldiers who had fought beside him and died while he was removed to safety. Angron carried that grief like a second spine. Magnus the Red was found on Prospero, leading a civilization of scholars and psychic practitioners that he had built in the image of his own extraordinary mind. He was the most powerful psyker among the Primarchs, a being of intellectual brilliance and genuine wisdom, but also of a certainty in his own judgment that would, eventually, undo much of what it had built. The Crusade continued for approximately 200 years in total, not 200 years of continuous warfare. There were periods of consolidation, of integration, of the slow, grinding work of turning conquered worlds into functioning parts of an empire. But the scale of achievement during those 2 centuries is almost impossible to comprehend. Thousands of worlds brought into the Imperium, alien civilizations pushed back or eliminated, human populations recovered from centuries of isolation and regression, given the tools and the institutional framework to function as part of something larger than themselves. Friction existed among the Primarchs almost from the beginning. These were 20 individuals of almost godlike capability, each with his own vision of what the Crusade should achieve and how it should achieve it. Rivalries emerged. Philosophical disagreements about the nature of the Imperial project hardened over decades into something more personal. Leman Russ and Lionel Johnson fought each other directly and with genuine ferocity over an argument about tactics and principle that neither was willing to concede. Perturabo, the Iron Warrior's Primarch, watched the glory of siege victories assigned to others, while his legion was condemned to the grinding, unglamorous work of fortification and attrition. Lorgar, whose word-bearers had built their entire identity around worship of the Emperor, something the Emperor himself found genuinely repugnant, since worship was exactly the kind of irrational devotion he was trying to eliminate from humanity, was humiliated publicly when the Emperor had the word-bearer's greatest achievement, the city of Monarchia on Kur, burned to the ground, and Lorgar forced to kneel before the ashes. That burning was a turning point. It was not because it was cruel. It was, by the Emperor's calculation, necessary. Lorgar's worship was the kind of thing that fed chaos, that gave the ruinous powers purchase in the material world, and allowing it to continue would have been a betrayal of the fundamental purpose of the Crusade. But Lorgar did not see it that way. Lorgar saw a father who had told him, by action rather than by word, that the love he had poured into his faith was worthless. And Lorgar, broken-hearted and furious in the way only the truly betrayed can be, turned away from the Emperor and towards something that was very, very willing to accept his devotion. What Lorgar found in the warp would change everything. But that story, the beginning of the end of the age of the Great Crusade, is inseparable from what the Emperor was building in secret, while his sons carried the crusade forward without him. Section 7. The Secret Beneath the Palace. Around the halfway mark of the Great Crusade, after the great victory at Ullanor, where Horus led the Imperial forces in the most decisive defeat of an alien power the Crusade had yet achieved, crushing a massive greenskin empire and scattering its armies across the stars, the Emperor did something that none of his sons had expected. He came home. He named Horus War Master. The title had not previously existed. There had been no need for it, because the Emperor himself had been the supreme authority directing the crusade. Which War Master meant something significant. It meant that Horus now commanded all of his brother Primarchs, all of their legions, all of the expeditionary fleets and Imperial army forces that made up the greatest military instrument in human history. It was the highest honor the Emperor had ever given to anyone. It was a declaration of absolute trust. And then the Emperor left, boarded his flagship and flew back to Terra and disappeared into the depths of the Imperial Palace. And for weeks, and then months, and then years, spoke to almost no one. Not to his sons. Not to the Council of Terror he had created to govern the growing empire in his absence. Not to Horus. Not to anyone except Malkador the Sigillite, his oldest and closest confidant, and the tech priest he had recruited for the project. The project. What the secret work that the Emperor had been building toward for much of his long life. And that would, if it succeeded, fundamentally transform the future of humanity. That would make the Great Crusade itself look, in retrospect, like a prologue. To understand what the Emperor was trying to build, you first need to understand the Webway. The Webway was an achievement of the Aeldari, the great alien civilization whose hedonism and excess had birthed Slaanesh and devastated their civilization in the process. It was a network of tunnels running through a layer of reality that was neither the physical universe nor the warp, but something between them. A stable, navigable dimension that could be entered through gates and traversed to reach virtually any point in the galaxy near instantaneously. As the Aeldari had used the Webway as the circulatory system of their civilization, a means of travel and communication that bypassed the warp entirely. The Old Ones, the ancient precursors from whom the Eldari had descended, had built it across millions of years. Since the fall of the Eldari, the Webway had fallen into disuse and partial disrepair. The Eldari who remained, the Craftworld Eldari, the Dark Eldari of Komorach, and others, still use portions of it, but vast stretches of the network were unmapped, unclaimed, and in some cases occupied by the kind of things that tend to occupy abandoned spaces in the 40,000 universe. Nothing good. The Emperor wanted to give humanity access to this network. Well, not just access in the way that individual Eldari still used it, snatching passages through gates when the situation permitted, but permanent, reliable, safe access. He wanted to construct a human extension of the Webway, branching out from a portal on Terra into the existing network, and then extending that network to every world of the Imperium. If he succeeded, humanity would be able to travel across the galaxy without using the warp at all. Ships would no longer need navigators, those psychically gifted mutants who were the only humans capable of steering through the immaterium. Astropaths, whose long-range communication ability depended on projecting their consciousness into the warp, would be less necessary. And the whole terrifying apparatus by which the Chaos Gods could reach into the material universe through the vulnerability of psychically sensitive humans would be progressively dismantled. This was what the Chaos Gods had feared most about the Emperor, not his armies, not his psychic power, his ambition for his species, because if humanity could navigate, communicate, and eventually exist entirely outside the warp's influence, if the Emperor could guide humanity's evolution toward a psychic state that was fully developed and fully controlled, no longer bleeding raw, unprotected emotion into a dimension where monsters made of emotion lived, then the Chaos Gods would lose their most important food source. They would not die, exactly, but they would be diminished in ways that made the galaxy genuinely safer. Just the key to the project was an artifact the Emperor had found in the desert region of Asia, buried under kilometers of rock, a device from the Dark Age of technology, possibly even older, of uncertain origin even to its discoverer, the Golden Throne. In its original state, the Golden Throne was not what most people in the 41st millennium think of when they hear the name. It was not a life support machine or an instrument of sacrifice. It was a psychic amplifier, a device of extraordinary sophistication that could take the consciousness of someone seated within it and project that consciousness into the webway, using the operator's psychic power, filtered and focused through the machine, to hold open a portal from Terra into the Eldari network. With someone of the Emperor's power seated in it, the Throne could not only hold that portal open, but provide the psychic protection necessary to keep the human-built extensions of the webway safe from the warp entities that would otherwise have flooded in. For years, the Emperor sat in the Golden Throne and built. Tens of thousands of Mechanicum tech priests and ordinary laborers were sent through the portal into the webway, through the golden doors that were large enough for a Titan to walk through without bowing. And they constructed tunnels, new passages, branching from the Eldari network, built in materials that were not the psychically resistant substance of the original webway, and therefore required the Emperor's constant attention to protect from psychic intrusion. Slowly, painstakingly, the network grew, a human webway, extending outward from Terra. Sure, none of his sons knew about it. The Emperor had kept the project secret from everyone except Malkador and the people directly working on it. His reasons were multiple: the sensitivity of the work, the fear that knowledge of it would reach the Chaos Gods and allow them to take countermeasures, the awareness that some of his sons, particularly Magnus, whose relationship with psychic experimentation went to extremes that the Emperor found alarming, might interfere if they knew what was being attempted. And perhaps because the Emperor had always been someone who trusted his own judgment about what others needed to know, and had a tendency to classify information about his own long-term plans as belonging in the category of not their business. This tendency was one of his most significant flaws, not because secrecy was always wrong, but because keeping the Primarchs in ignorance of something so fundamentally important, while simultaneously disappearing from the Crusade, and leaving them to manage its military affairs without explanation, and while reorganizing the Imperium's governance in ways that reduced the Primarch's political power in favor of civilian bureaucrats, created an environment of confusion and hurt that was extraordinarily fertile ground for exactly the kind of manipulation that Lorgar and his new Chaos Masters had been cultivating. The Council of Nicaea was one of the last major public acts of the Emperor during this period. It was a great conclave of the legions, called to settle a dispute that had been growing increasingly heated throughout the Crusade, the question of what to do about the Space Marine librarians. Every legion had librarians, Astartes who possessed psychic abilities and who were trained to use those abilities in battle. Some legions used them sparingly and with considerable caution. Others, particularly Magnus's Thousand Sons, had built their entire identity around psychic mastery, developing techniques and capabilities that went far beyond battlefield application into what looked, to the more conservative elements of the Imperium, uncomfortably like sorcery. The concern was real and it was legitimate. Psychic powers of sufficient magnitude attracted the attention of warp entities, and warp entities were not something to attract casually. At Nicaea, the Emperor ruled. The Edict of Nicaea. Librarians would be banned from service in the Space Marine legions. The use of psychic powers in combat was to be prohibited. Magnus the Red argued passionately against this ruling, argued that knowledge should not be suppressed, that understanding psychic power better was the only way to use it safely, that blanket prohibition was a counsel of ignorance and fear. He made an eloquent case. The Emperor listened to every word of it, and then ruled against him anyway. The decision reflected real wisdom. The Emperor understood that psychic power in the hands of Astartes, who were not adequately protected against corruption, was a genuine threat. He also understood things about the nature of the warp that he had not shared with his sons, and those things informed his judgment in ways that Magnus's argument, however intelligent, simply could not account for. But the decision also bruised Magnus in ways that had consequences. And then, from the world of Davin, the catastrophe began. Section 8, Corruption, betrayal, and the heresy ignites. There is a word that gets used a lot in discussions of the Horus heresy, and it is the word fall. Horus fell. The traitor Primarchs fell. The legions fell. As if falling was something that just happened to them. A kind of natural accident. A stone dropping from a height because gravity is a constant. This is not what happened. What happened was a conspiracy. Patient, methodical, decades in the making, executed with a precision that would be impressive if it were not also so completely catastrophic in its results. The Chaos Gods, particularly Tzeentch, the Changer of Ways, who specializes in exactly this kind of long-game manipulation, had been working toward this moment since before the Great Crusade began. What they had found their primary instrument in Lorgar, the word-bearer Primarch who had been humiliated by his father, and whose need for something to worship was as profound and consuming as any human appetite. Lorgar and his most trusted advisor, the chaplain Erebus, had spent years infiltrating the culture of the legions through what appeared to be harmless warrior lodges. These were secret societies within the Space Marine legions, drawing on the cultural practices of the primitive peoples of Davin and other worlds. Small groups of brothers who met privately, kept secrets from the wider legion, and developed loyalties that ran parallel to the official command structure. The Emperor had been explicitly warned that secret cabals in military organizations led to conspiracy and betrayal. He was right, and he was ignored. The lodges spread. Slowly, quietly, they put down roots in legion after legion. They did not immediately push toward chaos. They were patient, as their masters were patient, creating networks of trust and obligation that could be activated when the moment came. The moment came at Davin. Horus and the Lunar Wolves were fighting on Davin's moon against a planetary governor named Eugen Temba, who had been corrupted by Nurgle and turned a previously compliant world into a nest of plague zombies and demon-tainted horrors. During the fighting, Horus was struck by a weapon that should not have worked against him, a blade called the Anathame, an alien weapon of extraordinary purity that had been stolen from a human civilization called the Interrex by Erebus himself, what in a move that had destroyed what might have been a valuable alliance and been blamed on accident rather than design. The blade was dedicated to Nurgle and bore a specific anti-Primarch quality that bypassed everything that should have protected Horus from a wound that serious. He did not die, but the wound would not heal. His superhuman immune system, his regenerative capabilities, all the biological advantages that were supposed to make him effectively invulnerable to anything short of extraordinary force. None of it touched the wound. It festered. In a matter of days, the most vital and powerful being in the human galaxy was dying on a hospital ship while his men scrambled for options. And then Erebus suggested an option, the Davinite Serpent Lodge, a sect of healers on the moon's surface who were said to have techniques for treating wounds that refused normal treatment. The Lunar Wolves Mournival, Horus's inner council of closest advisors, agreed. None of them understood what they were walking him into. Inside the lodge, Horus's consciousness was transferred into the warp, and in the warp, he encountered something that had been prepared specifically for him. Erebus, wearing the face of Hastur Sejanus, Horus's closest friend, dead years before this moment, showed him a vision. Not a simple vision, a meticulously crafted lie designed to shatter the one relationship that had been the cornerstone of Horus's identity since the beginning of the Great Crusade. The vision showed Horus a future in which the Emperor became a god, worshipped, deified, elevated to a divine status that would have horrified the Emperor himself if he could have seen it. A future in which the Primarchs, the sons who had bled and fought and died to build this empire, were forgotten, relegated to the status of tools that had served their purpose, their memories lost to the religion of the masses. A future in which Horus himself was simply erased from history, replaced by the figure of the God Emperor, who needed no children because gods did not have families. And the Chaos Gods offered Horus an alternative, showed him a galaxy that could be different, a humanity that did not need to kneel, that the Emperor was wrong, not just mistaken, but willfully deceiving his sons, manipulating them, using them as instruments for his own apotheosis, that Horus, who loved humanity and his brothers and had given everything to the crusade, was the one who could see clearly and the one who could act. Horus was not a fool. He was, in fact, one of the most intelligent beings in the galaxy. But he had been wounded. Physically, yes, but more importantly in the deeper sense of a person who had been made to doubt the most fundamental thing he believed about his father. And that wound made him vulnerable to a lie that his reason, undamaged, might have seen through. He returned from the lodge changed. Not obviously, at first. He was still Horus. Still charismatic. Still brilliant. Still the War Master who commanded the absolute loyalty of millions. But something in the core of him had been touched by the warp and had not healed. A corruption so subtle that it would take years to fully manifest. Growing like a root, finding its way through stone, following every crack and weakness in his nature until it had wound itself around everything he was. While this was happening, the Emperor remained on Terra, sealed in his webway project, unreachable. Magnus the Red had felt what happened at Davin through his psychic sensitivity. He had seen, in the depths of his visions, what was coming. And he made a decision that he believed was the only option available to him. A decision made with genuinely good intentions that resulted in one of the most catastrophic single acts of the Horus heresy. He broke the Edict of Nicaea, knowing that conventional channels of communication had been corrupted, that the astropathic networks were compromised, was that any message sent through normal means might be intercepted by the enemies of the Imperium. Magnus used his full psychic power, unrestrained, to project a message directly through the warp to the Emperor on Terra. A message powerful enough to penetrate any defense, to reach past any barrier, to be absolutely certain of delivery. He was right that the message got through. It arrived with the force of a psychic battering ram. The Emperor, deep in the Golden Throne, maintaining the delicate psychic barriers that protected the human webway extension from the warp outside, felt those barriers shatter. Not weaken, not crack, shatter. Magnus's well-intentioned act of desperate warning tore through the most sophisticated psychic engineering the Emperor had ever constructed, destroyed years of careful work in a fraction of a second, and did something considerably worse. It opened a hole, not a metaphorical hole, a physical rupture in the barrier between the human webway and the warp, a breach that no one's psychic power was sufficient to simply close again. Through that breach, immediately and in enormous numbers, poured the denizens of the warp. Demons. Warp entities of every variety, drawn by the psychic energies that had been building in the webway during years of careful construction, flooding into the tunnels that had been built for human use and destroying everything in their path. The Custodian Guard and the Sisters of Silence who had been working inside the webway fought a desperate defensive battle, trying to hold back the demonic flood while the Emperor worked to contain the damage. It was, ultimately, a battle that could not be won. Whilst the human forces were eventually forced to abandon the webway entirely and retreat back into the Imperial Palace, the portal was sealed, but only the Emperor's own psychic power was sufficient to keep it sealed, which meant that he could not leave the Golden Throne. Not without the psychic seal breaking and the portal reopening and the demon flood pouring through into the very heart of humanity's capital. The Webway project was destroyed. Years of work, the Emperor's greatest ambition for humanity, the thing that had been meant to free them from their dependence on the warp, gone in the moment that one of his most gifted sons tried to help him. And the Emperor, unable to reach his sons directly because he could not leave the throne, could not even explain why, could not tell Horus what had happened, and could not warn the legions that the catastrophe Magnus had inadvertently triggered was nothing compared to the catastrophe that Erebus and Lorgar had been carefully building for years. The Horus heresy began in earnest with the events at Istvan III. Horus, now fully committed to the path the Chaos Gods had set him on, ordered his legion and 3 others to bombard the world with virus weapons. a biological apocalypse that killed hundreds of millions of people in minutes and targeted specifically the elements of those legions who had remained loyal to the Emperor. The survivors of the initial bombardment, their gene-enhanced bodies having resisted the worst of the biological weapons, fought on amid burning Prometheum, dying world by world as Horus's allies rained fire on them from orbit. Then came the drop site massacre at Istvenfath, where 7 loyalist legions arrived to punish the traitors and found, to their horror, that the trap was far larger than they had anticipated. 4 of the 7 legions had already turned. They waited until the others had committed their forces and then attacked from behind. 3 legions were effectively destroyed in a single engagement. Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, was killed, his head taken by Fulgrim of the Emperor's Children, a trophy of a betrayal so complete that even the traitors who committed it seemed not entirely certain what they had become. The galaxy burned. The heresy spread to dozens of systems simultaneously. Planets that had been part of the Imperium for decades suddenly found themselves in the middle of a civil war for which there was no adequate preparation. The Wordbearers, the Iron Warriors, all the Night Lords, the Alpha Legion, the Death Guard, the Thousand Suns, legions that together represented nearly half of all the Space Marines ever created, were fighting against the legions that remained loyal. And for every legion, there were Imperial army forces, Titan legions, and entire planetary populations whose allegiances were divided or unknown. The Emperor, trapped on the Golden Throne, directed what he could. He sent Malcador. He communicated through psychic vision and carefully transmitted orders. He worked to ensure that the forces that remained loyal were organized and deployed as effectively as possible. But he could not be present. He could not lead from the front, as he had during the Great Crusade. The Webway had taken that from him. And Magnus's well-meant act of warning had ensured that the price of maintaining the seal on the portal was the Emperor's personal absence from the war his son was waging against him. Rogal Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, took command of the defences of Terra. He received the great task of fortifying the Imperial Palace, a structure that was already, by any normal standard, the most heavily fortified complex in human history, to a standard that could withstand an assault by the most powerful military force ever assembled. He had roughly 8 years to do it. Section 9. The Siege of Terra, and the final confrontation when Horus finally came. He came with everything. The traitor armada that assembled in the solar system at the height of the Horus heresy was something that had no precedent in human history. Ships beyond counting, not just hundreds or thousands, but what contemporary accounts describe as effectively unending. A fleet so vast that it darkened the space around Terra like a second ring system around a gas giant. Legion after legion, their once proud colours now daubed with the iconography of chaos, their armour bearing the physical marks of corruption, demon engines, and things that had once been titans and walking horrors from the warp given physical form. And at the centre of all of it, the vengeful spirit, Horus's flagship, a Gloriana-class battleship the size of a small moon, whose void shields crackled with energies that went beyond mere electricity. The Siege of Terra lasted for 55 days, depending on which records you trust. Some accounts say longer. Just the fighting was of a kind that the planet had not seen even during the worst years of the Unification Wars. Because both sides in this conflict were operating at a scale and a capability that the techno-barbarians of the ancient world could never have approached. Rogal Dorn had done extraordinary work. The Imperial Palace stretched across an area the size of a continent, and every square metre of it had been fortified to the absolute limit of human engineering. Walls that could stop an orbital bombardment, void shield generators capable of deflecting direct fire from capital ships, kill zones, channels, fortified towers, bastion walls within bastion walls, each line of defense designed to channel attackers into fields of fire that would devastate them. Every approach was a trap. Every corridor was a killing ground. Dorn had spent years thinking about how to kill every kind of attacker the enemy might send, and he had built the answer in stone and plasteel and adamantium. It was not enough. How could it be enough? The traitor forces had the numbers, the resources, and the psychic support of 4 Chaos gods who were personally invested in the outcome. The loyalist defenders were outnumbered, and as the siege ground on, progressively exhausted, replacements came in limited numbers, supplies were constrained. The psychic pressure of the warp entities fighting alongside the traitors could not be blocked by physical fortifications, and the defenders endured assaults that went beyond the merely physical. Visions and whispers, and the constant grinding weight of despair that Nurgle's servants and Siencha's illusionists could generate without ever firing a weapon. Sanguinius held the Eternity Gate. That is the central image of the siege in most accounts. The great angel, bloodied and barely standing, killing hordes of enemies with a ferocity that even his brothers found awe-inspiring, keeping the innermost defenses intact through what appeared to be pure refusal to give up. He fought Angron, the demon primarch of the World Eaters, who had been elevated by Horn to a state of demonic power that should have been completely impossible to match. He fought a bloodthirster of terrifying scale. He fought continuous waves of the most dangerous warriors in the galaxy, and he did not break. He knew what was coming. His visions had been clear about that. He had known for years that he was going to die on this campaign, at the hands of his brother Horus, in a confrontation that his foresight could not quite resolve into something he could change. The question was not whether it happened, but whether his death served any purpose. When Horus detected that the Ultramarines and the Dark Angels, loyalist legions who had been cut off by the ruin storm that the Wordbearers had created, were only hours away from Terra, he understood that his window was closing. The loyalty of his Chaos Patron forces was absolute so long as victory was imminent, but if the reinforcements arrived and the siege turned into a prolonged attrition struggle, the certainty of that victory became much less certain. He needed to end this. Yet he lowered his void shields. It was deliberate, a calculated provocation, an open door, laid like a trap for someone who could not refuse to walk through it. The message was clear. Come, come and face me. Come to the vengeful spirit, and let this end here, between us, one way or the other. Malcador, still maintaining the golden throne in the Emperor's place, still enduring the psychic cost of what should have been impossible for any human being to sustain, detected the shield change and sent word. The Emperor received it. He knew it was a trap. He said so explicitly. He knew that Horus had planned for exactly this moment, and that walking through that open door was exactly what his son expected him to do. He also knew that there was no alternative. The loyalist reinforcements were hours away, but the palace could not hold for hours. And Sanguinius was dying by inches at the Eternity Gate, and more fundamentally, Horus was there. Horus, who had been his son and his favorite and his trusted instrument, and who had been twisted into something that was using Horus's face and Horus's voice, and the memory of everything Horus had once been, as a weapon against everyone who loved him. Malcador would remain on the Golden Throne. The Emperor had been honest with him about what this would cost. The throne was not designed for anyone other than the Emperor, and maintaining the seal on the Webway portal with a human psyker of even Malcador's extraordinary power was going to consume him completely. Malcador accepted this. He had been accepting it, in some sense, since the day he first understood what the throne was and what it would need. Yet he renamed himself Malcador the Hero at the Emperor's suggestion and took his seat. Sanguinius refused to stay behind. He had his reasons, his prophecy of his own death, and his conviction, born of the same gift that showed him his death, that the future was not completely fixed, that there was some possibility of changing what he had seen. The Emperor understood that reasoning. He had spent his entire existence trying to change futures that looked inevitable. He agreed to let the angel come. The teleportation assault onto the vengeful spirit was, from the moment of arrival, a disaster. Horus had anticipated every element of it. When the boarding party materialized aboard the flagship, his connection to the warp-infused ship allowed him to scatter them throughout the vessel's vast interior, and separating the Emperor's force into isolated groups, fighting their way through a demon-haunted labyrinth with no way to coordinate, no reliable communication, and enemies on every surface. The custodians fought their own death traps. Rogel Dawn materialized in a nightmare landscape that seemed to stretch for centuries in every direction and was not entirely located in the physical universe at all. Sanguinius found Horus first. The great angel was exhausted in ways that defied easy description. He had defended the Eternity Gate through the entire siege. He had fought monsters that should have killed him a dozen times over. He had carried the weight of his prophecy through every single hour of the fighting, knowing what was waiting for him at the end. And now he stood in the corrupted throne room of the Vengeful Spirit, a chamber that had once been a place of military command and was now an abomination of warp-touched flesh and impossible geometries, and faced the thing that wore his brother's body. Horus offered him a chance. Genuinely, or at least in the way that someone who has been consumed by chaos can offer anything genuinely. He asked Sanguinius to join him, to see what he had seen, to understand what the Emperor truly intended, to stand with him and build something better than what they had been building. Sanguinius refused. Without hesitation, without negotiation, without the kind of careful calculation that might have bought him a little more time. He refused, and he attacked with everything he had left, knowing it would not be enough. Horus killed him. As the accounts vary slightly in their details, and there is a persistent theory in some scholarly corners of the lore that something more complex happened in that final confrontation than the official record states. But the central fact is clear. Sanguinius died in that throne room, his body broken, his sacrifice complete, and in the dying, something happened. A crack in Horus's armor that was not entirely metaphorical, a vulnerability created by the angel's refusal to stop fighting even when fighting was hopeless. The Emperor arrived to find his most beloved son dead at Horus's feet. What happened in the final confrontation between the Emperor and Horus is one of the most analysed events in all of Warhammer 40,000 lore, and it is also one of the least clearly documented. Whilst the accounts that survived the Siege of Terror are incomplete and sometimes contradictory, what we know for certain is this: Horus, at the height of his power, had achieved something that no human being was supposed to be able to achieve. He had taken the energy of all four Chaos gods and concentrated it within himself to a degree that effectively elevated him to the status of a new Chaos entity. He was not merely a corrupted space marine. He was something closer to a god in the material world, a being of such concentrated warp power that he could reshape reality around him, that he could reach into the Emperor's psychic defenses and find every weakness, that his physical strikes carried the force not just of a Primarch's body, but of the entire ruinous powers behind every blow. The Emperor fought him, and for a time, the Emperor lost. Also, he had come to that confrontation carrying a terrible weight. The knowledge of what Horus had been, the grief of that loss, the psychological impossibility of simply annihilating someone who had been, for a significant portion of even an immortal's life, the thing he loved most in the world. The Emperor held back, not from weakness, not from fear, but from hope. Even at the end, even watching what Horus had become, some part of him was looking for the sun beneath the corruption, waiting for something that showed Horus was still there, still recoverable, still the being he had been. He found it only once, briefly, through the psychic connection that their shared genetic nature made possible. A flicker of the real Horus, still alive somewhere in the architecture of the creature's soul, screaming in horror at what had been done to him and what he had done, begging his father not to spare him, to end it. The Emperor heard that, and he stopped holding back. What he released in that moment was not power in any sense that an ordinary military analysis could measure. It was the accumulated psychic force of the most powerful human psyker in history, unrestrained for the first time in 10,000 years of careful control. It was the last thing the Chaos gods had been afraid of and had spent millennia engineering circumstances to prevent. And it struck Horus with a completeness that went beyond physical destruction. It did not merely kill his body, it burned his soul. It removed from the warp every trace of his psychic presence, every echo and residue that might have allowed any portion of what Horus had been to persist. From the Horus of the Chaos gods, the dark god in the making, The entity that had consumed and replaced the War Master ceased to exist, not diminished, not banished, extinguished. The Emperor fell, his body, subjected to Horus's chaos-enhanced assaults during the struggle before the final act, was in a state beyond what the word wounded can adequately capture. His bones were shattered, his flesh was ruined. The physical systems that had sustained his life for 10,000 years were failing at every level simultaneously. He lay in the throne room of the vengeful spirit next to the bodies of his greatest son and his greatest enemy, unable to move, barely able to think. The psychic light that had burned so brightly for so long, now guttering like a candle in a storm. Rogel Dawn found him, the Imperial Fist's Primarch, who had finally fought his way through whatever nightmare Horus had trapped him in, came to the throne room and found the devastation that awaited him. Horus dead, Sanguinius dead, his father in ruins, the war outside already shifting as the traitor forces, sensing through whatever psychic connection ran between them and Horus that the War Master had fallen, began to break and flee. The Emperor whispered instructions. "Take me to the Golden Throne." Section 10. The Golden Throne. Eternity's Price. They brought him home. Rogel Dawn and Constantine Valdor and the surviving custodians carried the Emperor's broken body from the vengeful spirit back through the still-burning space of the Sol system, pushed down to Terra and through the Imperial Palace that had been built in his honor and had spent the last 55 days being systematically torn apart by his enemies. They carried him to the deepest chambers of the palace, to the room where Malkador the Sigillite sat on the Golden Throne, sustaining with nothing but his extraordinary human will the psychic seal that stood between Terra and the demonic overflow of the ruined webway. Malkador had been on the throne for the entire duration of the final confrontation, a period of psychic exertion that should have been impossible for any human being, no matter how gifted, no matter how trained, no matter how prepared. He had known, when he took his seat, that he would not get up from it. He had known it, and he had done it anyway. Because Malkador the Sigillite had spent his very long life watching the Emperor do the necessary thing at whatever cost the necessary thing demanded. And he had learned somewhere along the way to share that willingness. When they brought the Emperor back and began the process of transferring him to the throne, Malkador released his hold on the device. He had been burning, in the psychic sense, from the inside, the throne consuming his life force because it had not been designed for anyone but the Emperor, and maintaining the seal without the Emperor's power required everything Malkador possessed, and then some. When he let go, the sentries fell on him all at once. He crumbled to dust. The Emperor had renamed him Malkador the Hero before the boarding of the vengeful spirit. So that name means something that goes beyond the conventional meaning of the word. Hero is a term the Imperium applies to many people who die in wars, but Malkador's death was not a death in battle. It was a death by choice, sustained over days, in the quiet of a chamber deep beneath the Imperial Palace, with no one watching except the machines and the memories of a lifetime spent in service. He chose it, and he endured it, and he did not stop enduring it until the person he had been serving for longer than any other human alive could take his place. The Golden Throne was modified in the days and weeks after the Siege of Terra ended. The original device, which had been designed as a portal interface and psychic amplifier, was rebuilt into something new, a life support system of extraordinary complexity, capable of sustaining a body that could no longer sustain itself, while simultaneously amplifying the psychic presence of the mind within it to compensate for the failing biological systems. Mechanicum tech priests worked day and night on the modifications, drawing on the deepest technical knowledge they possessed, and what they built was functional. It kept the Emperor alive, in the same sense that a respirator keeps a patient alive. It was not recovery. It was not healing. It was maintenance of a state that was otherwise not compatible with continued existence. And the Emperor began his vigil. What the Emperor actually does within the Golden Throne, what his consciousness experiences, what he perceives, what he works toward, is one of the great mysteries of the 41st millennium. He does not speak, because he has not spoken in 10,000 years. not in any way that anyone has been able to decode with certainty. The tarot cards, the omens that the devotional cults of the Imperium interpret as his will, these are attempts to read a signal that may or may not exist in the form people hope it does. The rare individuals who have been granted a direct audience with the Emperor, the highest of the High Lords, the most senior custodians, certain extraordinary servants of the Imperium over the millennia, describe an experience of overwhelming psychic presence, the sensation of a mind too vast to fully perceive pressing against the inside of one's skull, but not words, not instructions, not the clear, decisive authority of a living ruler. What we know he does is this: he maintains the Astronomicon. The Astronomicon is a psychic beacon. Well, it has been described, by those with the sensitivity to perceive it, as a chorus of voices beginning with a single note and expanding into a full choir, a sensation of silver light and harmonics that can be detected across approximately 70,000 light-years of the galaxy. It is the fixed reference point that allows human navigators, the psychically gifted mutants who pilot humanity's starships through the warp, to determine their position and chart a course. Without the Astronomicon, warp navigation becomes essentially impossible. Ships would be lost in the immaterium without any way to know where they were or how to get where they were going. The Imperium, which depends on constant movement of ships between its worlds for everything from military reinforcement to basic supply, would grind to a halt within years and begin to collapse within decades. The Emperor's mind, even in its damaged, diminished, life support dependent state, is still the most powerful psychic presence humanity has ever produced. His consciousness, projected into the warp through the mechanisms of the Golden Throne, provides the direction and coherence that make the Astronomicon's signal interpretable. He cannot generate all the energy the beacon requires. That requires the sacrifice of human souls, but he can shape and direct that energy in ways that nothing else can replicate. This is where the 1,000 psychers a day come from. Every single day, for over 10,000 years, human beings have been brought to the chamber of the Astronomicon beneath the Imperial Palace and drained of their life force to fuel the Emperor's work. So these are not random individuals grabbed off the streets. They are psychers, people born with the psychic sensitivity that makes them valuable as a power source for the throne's mechanisms. They are recruited, in many cases as children, by the black ships of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, vessels that patrol the entire galaxy collecting psychically gifted individuals who would otherwise represent a danger to their communities and themselves. Some of these people become astropaths, trained to serve the Imperium as long-range communicators, their souls bound to the Emperor through the soul-binding ritual that gives them a measure of protection from the warp's predations. Some become sanctioned psychers who serve in Imperial military forces, and some, those who have been selected for the Adeptus Astronomica, those who have trained as acolytes and achieved the mystical state the Order calls chosen, are brought to the chamber and spend their lives feeding the beacon. They fade and die over months or years of service, their psychic energy slowly consumed, and they are replaced by others, in an unbroken chain that has continued without interruption since the end of the Horus Heresy. 1,000 of them die every single day. That is not a typo. Every single day, 1,000 human beings are consumed by this process. In a year, 365,000 lives. In a century, more than 36 million. In 10,000 years of this, the span of time that has passed since the Emperor was placed on the throne, the number exceeds anything that arithmetic can make feel real. It is simply a number too large to comprehend as individual human lives, and yet each one was a person with their own history and their own experience of the universe. The Emperor had not intended this. The original arrangement, reached during the Great Crusade, when the Astronomicon first needed external power sources to supplement the Emperor's direct contribution while he focused on the Webway project, was meant to be temporary. Malcador had suggested the compromise, and the Emperor had accepted it with the explicit understanding that it would not be permanent, that he had no intention of claiming thousands of lives on a regular basis indefinitely. The Webway project was supposed to make the Astronomicon obsolete. Safe interstellar travel without the warp, without navigators, almost without any of the apparatus that required this particular kind of sacrifice. The Webway project is gone. It has been gone for 10,000 years, and so the sacrifice continues, because the alternative, the Astronomicon going dark, the fleet going blind, the Imperium dying, is considered by those who make the calculation to be considerably worse. There is, threading through all of this, a question of what the Emperor thinks about it, whether he is aware, in the depths of whatever consciousness the Golden Throne sustains, of the full weight of what is being done in his name, whether he would sanction it if asked, whether there is any way to ask. Was the Imperium as it exists in the 41st millennium has resolved this question by making it a religious matter. The Psykers who die feeding the throne are described as making the ultimate sacrifice for the Emperor's divine purpose, their deaths holy, their service an act of worship. Whether this framing would have horrified the man who spent 10,000 years trying to eliminate religious thinking from human society is a question that the ecclesiarchy does not encourage anyone to ask too loudly. The Golden Throne itself is failing. This is known, in the 41st millennium, to the highest levels of the Mechanicum and to the most senior members of the Imperium's governing bodies. The technology involved is from the Dark Age of technology, which means that no one alive fully understands how it works. Was the tech priests who tend the throne are maintaining it through a combination of deep technical knowledge, accumulated tradition, and something uncomfortably close to ritual, prayers to the machine spirit of a device whose designers are 10,000 years dead and whose schematics exist, if they exist at all, in archives that no one can read with full confidence. Attempts to repair or improve the throne have occasionally gone catastrophically wrong, killing scores of tech priests, and in at least one case, nearly killing the Emperor himself. By the final years of the 41st millennium, before the events that split the galaxy along the Cicatrix Maledictum and forced the resurrection of the Primarch Reboot Guilliman, the Mechanicum had concluded that failures were present in the throne's mechanisms that exceeded their ability to repair, and that the device was deteriorating in ways that their most advanced diagnostic tools could not fully characterize, that the number of Psykers needed to maintain its function had increased fourfold over the preceding several thousand years, and that no clear technical solution existed. What happens if the throne fails completely is a question that Imperial scholars answer in hushed voices, and only in rooms they are certain are secure. The Astronomicon goes dark, the psychic seal on the ruined Webway, which has been kept closed by the Emperor's presence for 10,000 years, and which, if it opened, would pour the accumulated warp horrors of a decade of warfare through into the most sacred ground in the Imperium, fails. The Emperor's consciousness, which has been quietly maintaining psychic barriers around the Sol system against the worst intrusions of the warp, withdraws. And everything that has been held at bay by the presence of the most powerful psychic mind in human history simply stops being held. There are theories about what comes next, about what the Emperor's purpose on the throne truly is, about whether his mind, in those 10,000 years of enforced immobility, has been doing something more than just maintaining the Astronomicon. Some scholars, working very carefully, in private, with full awareness of the inquisitorial consequences of what they're suggesting, theorize that the Emperor's consciousness in the warp has grown into something genuinely new. Not the man who boarded the vengeful spirit 10 millennia ago, not even the god figure the ecclesiarchy worships, but something that the universe has not seen before, a psychic entity of enormous power, still anchored to mortality by the failing mechanism of the throne, still aware, still working towards something that his followers can only partially perceive. There is the question of the Star Child. The lore describes it this way: when the Emperor was mortally wounded by Horus, most of his psychic force dispersed from his body in the same way that the shaman's souls had dispersed from theirs 10,000 years ago. That dispersal was not destruction. The shamans had pulled their souls and created the Emperor. And the Emperor, whose soul is the sum of all those shamans, and his own 10,000 years of accumulated experience may be doing something similar, slowly, across the vast span of the 41st millennium, preparing, in the warp, the seed of something that could reincarnate, that could be born new into the physical universe. The Star Child cannot be born while the Emperor remains connected to the Golden Throne. The connection that keeps his body alive also prevents his soul from completing whatever process would allow it to reconstitute. It is a terrible paradox. The very thing that preserves him also prevents him from becoming what he might need to become. Every 1,000 psychers added to the daily sacrifice buys another day of physical maintenance at the cost of delaying or preventing the thing that might actually save humanity, rather than merely postponing its destruction. There are people in the Imperium, even now, who argue that the throne should be shut down, that the Emperor should be allowed to die, truly die, in the biological sense, so that whatever is building in the warp can complete its formation, that the Astronomicon going dark would be catastrophic in the short term and survivable in the long term, if what replaces the dying Emperor is something capable of confronting the Chaos Gods directly. These arguments are heresy in the formal imperial sense of that word, which means that making them openly in the wrong company tends to end with a visit from the Inquisition and a significantly shorter future. And so the situation continues. The Emperor sits on the Golden Throne at the heart of the Imperial Palace on Terra, in the city continent that has been built above and around the machinery that sustains him. His custodians guard his physical form with the same devotion they have maintained for 10,000 years, was the same martial discipline, the same absolute refusal to be removed from their post. The black ships continue their endless circuits of the galaxy. The psychers continue to come to the chamber. The light continues to burn. And across the galaxy, on a million worlds under the light of alien stars, people look up at the night sky and offer their prayers. Many of them have never met a space marine, have never seen the golden majesty that the propaganda paintings show, have never experienced anything of the Imperium except its taxes and its conscription and the occasional visit of an Arbites patrol. But they know the Emperor's name. They were taught it before they were taught almost anything else. They speak it when they are afraid, as in the way that human beings in every era have reached for the name of their deity when the darkness seemed too close and the world too hostile and the future too uncertain. The Emperor protects. Whether that remains true, whether the light that has been burning for 10,000 years is genuinely protective, or has become merely the memory of protection, a habit of faith outlasting the capacity for the thing the faith describes, is perhaps the central question of Warhammer 40,000, and it is, deliberately, a question that has no clean answer. The Emperor's story does not end at the Golden Throne. It continues in the dark, in the silence, in the ongoing weight of a mind that was built for 10,000 years of preparation, and is now 10,000 years into something none of the shamans who created it could ever have imagined. And from a Stone Age village on the banks of a river in Anatolia to a golden chair beneath the greatest fortress in human history, from the first child of the shaman's sacrifice to the last anchor of a civilization too vast and too damaged to be saved by anything less than a miracle, from the new man to the God Emperor to the barely alive secret at the heart of the Imperium that everyone depends on and almost no one truly understands. This is his story. This is what he was, and what he built, and what it cost him, and what it cost everything and everyone around him. The victories and the betrayals and the impossible choices made in the dark with no good options, and the long, grinding weight of being the person that 10,000 years of human history somehow produced at exactly the moment when humanity needed something like him most. As he is still there, 10,000 years after the fires of the siege went out, still burning, still refusing to stop, whatever that means. Whatever he is now, whatever he is becoming, the light has not gone out yet, and in the grim darkness of the far future, that might be the most remarkable thing about him. Closing, the question that remains, there is something worth sitting with. As we come to the end of this story, the Emperor spent his entire existence 10,000 years before the Great Crusade, 200 years of crusade, 10,000 years on the throne, working toward a future that has not arrived yet. His Webway project was destroyed, his sons divided, and half of them turned against him. His Imperium became the kind of superstitious, religion-haunted, a priest-ridden organization that he had dedicated his life to dismantling. The galaxy is, in many ways, darker now than it was when he first stepped forward in the 29th millennium to announce himself. And yet, the species survives. The Astronomicon burns. On a million worlds, human beings wake up every morning and feed their children, and argue with their neighbors, and fall in love, and make mistakes and try again, the way they always have, in defiance of every force in the universe that would prefer they didn't. The Chaos Gods have not won. The Xenos have not consumed the last human world. The light, however battered and costly and morally compromised, has not gone out. This is not nothing. This is, in fact, almost everything. As whether the Emperor would recognize the Imperium of the 41st millennium as what he intended, whether the god they worship in his name would horrify the man who declared that humanity would not be free until the last stone from the last church was cast down onto the last priest, is a question the lore leaves deliberately open. There is grief in that open space. There is also, perhaps, something else. The suggestion that even the best laid plans of the most powerful being in human history can be altered beyond recognition by the stubbornness of reality, and that what survives may be different from what was intended without being worthless. Consider the pattern of his existence. The shamans died to make him. Malcador died to sustain the seal that brought him home. Was Sanguinius died on the vengeful spirit, in a confrontation that may have been the only thing that made the final victory possible. The Psykers die every single day. The Emperor's story, from its very first moment, is built from the shape of sacrifice, not as decoration, but as architecture. The entire structure of what humanity has been able to sustain in the 41st millennium rests on layers of people who gave everything they had, and in many cases, everything they were, so that the species could continue. There is something both terrible and oddly moving about that. The Imperium is dysfunctional, authoritarian, frequently monstrous in its methods, and deeply lost from the vision its founder intended for it. None of that is wrong. But it is also the civilization that has stood against extinction for 10,000 years with a dying god at its center, and somehow not completely fallen apart. When you look at the full sweep of what the Emperor built, starting from nothing in a Stone Age village, with nothing but time and will and the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 years of human experience, the imperfections of what that built project became feel less like failures and more like scars. Evidence of how hard the fight was. Proof that the fight was real. He built a species that survives. Not elegantly, not the way he would have chosen, but it survives. There is one last thing worth saying. In the Warhammer 40,000 universe, the future is never fully determined, as the lore is full of possibilities and prophecies and theories about what might yet happen, whether the Emperor rises, whether the throne can be saved, whether the Star Child finds its birth, whether humanity can navigate the catastrophic fracturing of the galaxy that the 41st millennium has brought. None of these questions are settled. That is a deliberate choice by the people who built this universe, and it is the right choice, because the uncertainty is the point. The Emperor's story does not have an ending yet. It is still unfolding, in the dark, in the silence, in the vast and complicated machinery of a fictional universe that has been asking questions about human nature and the cost of survival for the better part of 4 decades. What is the Emperor? A man, a god, a monster, a father. A visionary who saw farther than anyone else and still managed to miss things that were right in front of him. A being of extraordinary love and extraordinary coldness, sometimes in the same moment. The product of the most selfless sacrifice in the history of the setting, who was capable of liquidating his most loyal soldiers without hesitation when their usefulness was spent. Every one of those things, simultaneously, without contradiction, because that is what the universe he inhabits is built to accommodate. In the end, For a being whose entire existence was shaped by the singular determination that humanity would not be extinguished, that might be enough to constitute something like victory. The Emperor protects.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.